At the will reading, my uncle announced the entire estate, $430,000, was split between his kids only. My 8-year-old son sat quietly next to me, swinging his legs beneath the leather chair. The lawyer said there was one more page. My uncle laughed. Probably just instructions for the burial. I didn't speak. The lawyer handed me the sealed envelope and said my grandfather wrote this 3 weeks before he died. It says read page 12 aloud. My uncle's face went completely still. Let me tell you how we got here. The conference room had windows that overlooked the parking lot. I could see my uncle's Escalade in the reserved spot nearest the door. My sister's Lexus beside it. My mother had ridden with my uncle. I'd driven my 10-year-old Accord with a dent in the rear bumper from when I backed into a shopping cart. Nobody had noticed when we arrived. Nobody ever noticed what I drove. My son had asked me that morning if Grandpa left him anything. I told him we'd find out together. He nodded and went back to his cereal. He was good at being quiet in rooms full of adults who talked over him. He'd had practice. The estate wasn't massive by some standards. My grandfather had been a machinist for 40 years, owned his home outright, had some savings. $430,000 split 3 ways between my uncle's 2 kids and my sister's daughter. My son wasn't mentioned. Neither was I. The lawyer had gone through every line. My uncle kept glancing at me like he expected me to cry or object. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and said there was an additional document. My family has always operated on a very clear hierarchy. My uncle was the oldest. My sister was the successful one. My mother made sure everyone knew their place. I was the one who'd gotten pregnant at 22 by a man who left before the baby was born. The one who never quite got it together. The one who worked reception jobs and lived in a small apartment and drove old cars. At least that's what they thought. Growing up, my grandfather was the only one who asked me questions. Real questions. Not how's work going, but what are you reading? What are you thinking about? What do you want? When I was 16, he took me to his workshop in the garage and showed me how he'd built the cabinets for my grandmother's kitchen. He said the difference between good work and great work was whether you cared if anyone noticed. He said most people never notice. But you still do great work because you notice. After I had my son, my family's opinion of me crystallized into something permanent. My mother told people I'd made my choices, and now I had to live with them. My sister stopped inviting me to things unless it was a major holiday she couldn't exclude me from without looking cruel. My uncle offered to help me find a job at the plant where he worked in management. Something with benefits. Something stable. I thanked him and said I'd think about it. What they didn't know is that I'd been building something since my son was 2 years old. It started small. I was working reception at a medical practice, and one of the doctors mentioned she needed help organizing her financial documents for tax season. She offered me $200. I spent a weekend sorting through her files and setting up a basic system. She referred me to another doctor. Then another. Within 6 months, I had 12 clients paying me to manage their paperwork and basic bookkeeping. I took an online accounting certification course during my son's nap times and after his bedtime. It took me 14 months to complete what was supposed to be a 9-month program. I didn't tell anyone in my family what I was doing. When my mother asked how work was going, I said fine. When my sister asked if I was still at the medical office, I said yes. Technically I was. I still worked the front desk 3 days a week. The other 4 days I ran my business from home. By the time my son was 5, I had 37 clients. Small business owners, mostly. People who needed someone to handle their books, but couldn't afford a full-time accountant. I charged less than the big firms and more than the software solutions. I was good at it. I was very good at it. My clients stayed with me because I noticed things. Discrepancies. Opportunities. I saved one client $18,000 by catching an error in his quarterly tax filing. He told his business partner. His business partner told 3 other people. My mother told me I should go back to school for nursing. She said there was good money in nursing and I'd have job security. I was filing incorporation papers for my LLC that afternoon. When my son was 6, my sister invited us to Thanksgiving. She had just bought a new house. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, in a subdivision with a community pool. She gave everyone a tour. My mother kept saying how proud she was, how smart my sister was with money, how she'd really built something for herself. My uncle said his daughter was looking at houses in the same area. Maybe they'd be neighbors. My sister beamed. We sat down to dinner and my mother asked me how things were going. I said good. She patted my hand and said she knew it was hard doing it alone, but I was doing the best I could. My sister offered to pass along the name of the company that did their landscaping. She said they were very affordable. I thanked her. I had signed a contract with a commercial real estate firm that morning to handle the books for all 17 of their properties. The contract was worth $93,000 annually. If you're the kind of person who roots for the underdog, and I mean really roots for them, go ahead and subscribe. Because what I did next is the reason I am telling you this story. I called my attorney the following Monday. Her name was Patricia Reyes. I'd hired her 2 years earlier when my business grew large enough that I needed legal counsel. She was expensive. She was worth it. I told her I needed to structure my assets in a way that protected my son's future. She asked what I had in mind. I told her. She said it would take about 6 weeks to set everything up properly. I said that was fine. My grandfather called me 3 days later. He asked if I could come by the house. Just me, not my son. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I told my clients I had a family emergency and drove to his place. He was sitting in the living room with a folder in his lap. He said he wanted to show me something. The folder contained copies of the deed to his house, his bank statements, and his investment accounts. He walked me through every page. He said he knew what my uncle and sister thought the estate was worth. He said they were wrong. There was the house and the savings they knew about. But there was also an investment account he'd been funding for 38 years. It was worth considerably more than anyone realized. He asked me what I'd been doing with my life. Really doing. I started to give him the usual answer, and he held up his hand. He said he'd gotten a piece of mail at my address by mistake 6 months ago. Something from the Secretary of State's office. Something with my business name on it. He'd been waiting to see if I'd tell him about it. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd always known I noticed things other people missed. He said that mattered more than people thought. He asked me if my son was taken care of. I said he would be. He nodded. He said good. He told me he was going to make some changes to his will. He said my uncle and sister would get what they expected. But there would be something else. Something for my son. He said he wanted to make sure the people who noticed things were taken care of. I started to cry and he told me to stop that. He said this was just woodworking. You build something right and it lasts. That was 8 months before he died. I didn't tell anyone about the conversation. My grandfather didn't bring it up again. We had dinner every few weeks like we always had. He asked my son about school. He asked me about work. I kept my answers vague. My business was approaching $400,000 in annual revenue. I had hired 2 part-time contractors to help with the workload. I was preparing to bring on my first full-time employee. My mother called one Sunday and said my grandfather was in the hospital. Pneumonia. He was 81. They thought he'd recover, but they were keeping him for observation. I drove to the hospital with my son. My uncle was already there. My sister arrived 20 minutes later. My mother held my grandfather's hand and told him to rest. He'd be home soon. He looked at me and asked if I'd been working on anything interesting. I said, always. He smiled. He came home 4 days later. Weaker than before, but stable. My mother wanted to hire a home care nurse, but he refused. He said he was fine. My uncle said he'd check in every few days. My sister said she'd bring groceries. I said I'd come by on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Nobody questioned that. Those were the days I supposedly had off from the medical office. On the 3rd Thursday, I brought my laptop. I told my grandfather I had some work to finish and asked if he minded if I sat with him while I did it. He said that was fine. I opened my files and worked while he watched television. After an hour, he asked what I was working on. I showed him the spreadsheet. A quarterly reconciliation for a client who owned 3 auto repair shops. He asked questions. Good questions. I answered them. He said it looked like I knew what I was doing. I said I'd had a good teacher about doing things right even when nobody noticed. He died 3 weeks later. Heart attack in his sleep. My mother found him when she came by to bring him dinner. The funeral was on a Saturday. My uncle gave the eulogy. He talked about hard work and family and legacy. My sister read a poem. My mother cried. I sat in the third row with my son and held his hand. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday. I knew what was coming, not the specifics. My grandfather hadn't told me the details, but I knew he'd done something. I could feel it in the way my mother kept looking at me during the funeral, like she was waiting for me to fall apart, like she expected me to need something from them. I took the morning off work. Real work. I told my clients I had a family matter. My biggest client, a construction company with 43 employees, asked if everything was okay. I said it would be. He said to take whatever time I needed. I'd saved his company $117,000 the previous year by restructuring their payroll system and catching an insurance billing error. He trusted me. I dressed carefully that morning. Black dress, simple. The same one I'd worn to the funeral. My son wore his navy pants and white shirt. He asked again if Grandpa had left him anything. I said I didn't know. I said whatever happened, we'd be okay. He believed me. He always believed me. We arrived at the lawyer's office 10 minutes early. My uncle's Escalade was already there. So was my sister's Lexus. My mother was inside, sitting in the waiting area with her purse in her lap. She looked up when we came in. She said we were cutting it close. I checked my watch. We were 8 minutes early. I didn't say anything. The lawyer called us into the conference room at exactly 10 o'clock. We sat around the table. My uncle at the head. My sister next to him. My mother across from her. Me at the far end with my son beside me. The lawyer introduced himself as Richard Morrison. He'd handled my grandfather's affairs for 16 years. He expressed his condolences. My uncle nodded solemnly. Morrison opened the folder in front of him and began reading. The language was formal, legal. My grandfather's full name, his date of birth, his statement of sound mind and body. The usual preamble. Then the distributions. The house and its contents to be sold, the proceeds divided equally between my uncle and my sister. My uncle nodded like he'd expected this. My mother looked satisfied. Then the financial assets. Morrison listed the bank accounts. Checking, savings. The numbers matched what my uncle had probably estimated. 63,000 in savings. 11,000 in checking. To be divided equally between my uncle and my sister. My sister smiled at my mother. Then Morrison mentioned the investment account. My uncle sat up slightly. Morrison read the current value. $356,000. To be divided equally between my uncle's 2 children and my sister's daughter. Approximately $118,000 each. My mother's hand went to her chest. My uncle's face went red. My sister grabbed her phone like she wanted to calculate something. Morrison kept reading. The total estate value, $430,000. My son's legs stopped swinging. My uncle recovered first. He cleared his throat and said that was very generous of Dad. Very thoughtful to think of the grandchildren. My sister agreed. She said it was exactly what their kids needed. Down payments on houses. College funds. Real opportunities. My mother said my grandfather had always been so good with money. Nobody mentioned my son. Morrison started to close the folder. Then he stopped. He said there was one additional document. A codicil added 3 weeks before my grandfather's death. My uncle's expression shifted slightly. He asked what kind of codicil. Morrison said it was sealed. With specific instructions. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. Sealed with red wax. My grandfather's initials pressed into it. Morrison looked at me. He said the envelope was addressed to me. The instructions were written on the outside in my grandfather's handwriting. My uncle leaned forward to look. My sister's smile faded. Morrison turned the envelope so I could see it. The words were clear. Read page 12 aloud. My uncle laughed. The sound was sharp. He said it was probably just instructions for the burial. Maybe something about where to spread the ashes. My grandfather had been very specific about things like that. My sister nodded. She said Dad always had his preferences. Morrison looked at me and asked if I wanted to open it now or take it home. My uncle said we might as well get it over with. Everything else was settled. I reached for the envelope. My hands were steady. I broke the wax seal and pulled out the pages inside. Standard letter-sized paper. My grandfather's handwriting. I could feel my uncle watching me. My sister had her phone in her hand. My mother's purse was still in her lap. I looked at my son. He was looking at me. I started reading page 1. It was a letter. To me. My grandfather's voice coming through in every line. He said he'd spent his whole life building things that lasted. He said the best thing he'd ever built was the time he spent with people who noticed what mattered. He said I'd always noticed. Even when I was small. Even when other people were louder or seemed more certain. He said that quality was rare and it meant something. He said he'd watched me build my own life quietly and carefully. He said he respected that I hadn't needed anyone to see it or validate it. But he also said there came a time when being quiet stopped being strategic and started being a disservice to the people who loved you. He said my son deserved to know what his mother had accomplished. He said my family deserved to know who I really was. My uncle shifted in his chair. My sister glanced at my mother. Morrison sat very still. Page 2 detailed the investment account nobody knew about. The one my grandfather had mentioned that afternoon in his living room. He'd opened it in 1978. He'd been contributing to it steadily for 38 years. He'd never touched it. Never told anyone about it. He'd planned to leave it to my grandmother, but she'd died before him. So it became part of his estate planning. The account was worth $1.2 million. My sister's phone clattered onto the table. My uncle made a sound in his throat. My mother's face went completely white. Morrison nodded like he'd already seen these numbers. Page 3 explained where it was going. The entire amount. All of it. To a trust for my son. Managed by me as trustee until he turned 25. At which point he could assume full control or keep me on as co-trustee if he chose. The trust was already established. The account had already been transferred. The paperwork was complete. My grandfather had signed it 3 days before he died. My uncle found his voice first. He said there must be some mistake. He said his father wouldn't have kept that kind of money hidden. My sister said it didn't make sense. Why wouldn't he have mentioned it? Morrison said the account was entirely legal and properly documented. My grandfather had every right to structure his estate however he chose. My mother looked at me. She said I must have known. I must have convinced him somehow. My uncle's face was getting redder. He said I'd obviously manipulated an old man who wasn't thinking clearly. My sister said we should contest it. Morrison said they were welcome to try. The documentation was thorough. My grandfather had been evaluated by 2 independent physicians 4 days before signing the codicil. Both confirmed he was of sound mind. I turned to page 12. The page my grandfather wanted me to read aloud. My hands were still steady. My son had stopped swinging his legs. The room was completely quiet except for my uncle's breathing. I started reading. My grandfather's handwriting was careful. He'd taken his time with this page. He said if I was reading this aloud it meant his family was sitting there shocked. Probably angry. Probably confused about why he gives so much to one grandchild and not the others. He said he wanted to explain. He said my uncle's kids would be fine. They had 2 parents with good jobs and no debt and a strong support system. My sister's daughter would be fine for the same reasons. They'd get their inheritance and it would help them. But they didn't need it the way my son needed it. He said my son had one parent who'd built something from nothing while everyone around her dismissed her. One parent who worked 3 times as hard to get half as far. One parent who never asked for help because she'd learned early that nobody was offering. He said that parent deserved to know her father saw what she'd accomplished. Even if nobody else did. Then he told me to stop hiding. He said I'd spent 8 years protecting my son from disappointment by keeping our real life private. He understood why. But he said my son needed to know what his mother had built. Not because it was about money. Because it was about what you do when people underestimate you. You don't prove them wrong by announcing it. You prove them wrong by building something so solid they can't ignore it even when they try. He said I'd done that. Now it was time to stop letting people like my uncle and sister think they knew my life. He said the trust would give my son options, education, opportunities, security. But the real gift was watching me show everyone in that room who I'd become while they weren't paying attention. If you are still here, I need you to do something for me. Hit subscribe. Because in about 2 minutes, everything I just told you about, every quiet meeting, every document, every number, it all comes together. And I do not want you to miss it. The last paragraph was addressed to my uncle and sister. My grandfather said he loved them. But he said they'd had every advantage and they'd used those advantages to build comfortable lives while looking down on the people who had to work harder. He said that wasn't kindness. That was cruelty dressed up as concern. He said my son's trust was his way of balancing the scales. Not because my uncle and sister didn't deserve their inheritance, but because my son deserved his chance. He signed it, Dad and Grandpa. I set the pages down on the table. My son was looking at me with questions in his eyes. My uncle's face had gone from red to purple. My sister looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. My mother's mouth was opening and closing, but no sound was coming out. Morrison broke the silence. He said he had additional documentation if anyone wanted to review the account transfers and trust structure. My uncle said this was insane. He said his father had clearly been manipulated. Morrison reminded him that 2 doctors had confirmed competency. He said if my uncle wanted to pursue legal action, he was certainly entitled to try. But the will and codicil would stand up to any challenge. My sister found her voice. She asked me how long I'd known. I told her my grandfather mentioned he was making changes 8 months ago. He didn't tell me the details. She asked if I'd asked him to do it. I said no. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her face. My uncle demanded to know what I'd said to convince his father to cut his grandchildren out of most of the estate. I told him I didn't convince anyone of anything. I told him my grandfather made his own choices. My uncle slammed his hand on the table. He said I'd been scheming, playing the victim, making their father feel sorry for me while I worked him over. Morrison warned him to lower his voice. My uncle ignored him. My mother finally spoke. She said she'd always known I was calculating. She said I'd learned early how to manipulate people's sympathy. Get pregnant young, struggle publicly, make everyone feel sorry for poor Sarah trying to raise a baby alone. She said apparently I'd gotten very good at it. Good enough to steal over $1 million from my own family. I looked at her. I asked her if she really believed I'd manipulated my grandfather. She said what else could explain it. I asked if it was possible he just saw something in me that she didn't. She said that was ridiculous. She knew exactly who I was. She'd been watching me make poor choices my entire adult life. I reached into my bag. I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me, just in case. I'd hoped I wouldn't need it, but I'd learned to prepare for every scenario. That's what good work meant. You anticipated the problems and you had solutions ready. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. My LLC registration. Filed 6 years ago. My mother stared at it. I pulled out the second document. My business license. Current and valid. My sister leaned forward to see it. I pulled out the third document. My most recent quarterly revenue report. Certified by my accountant. $417,000 in gross revenue for the previous 3 months. My uncle grabbed the paper. He said this had to be fake. Nobody makes that kind of money doing bookkeeping. I told him I didn't do bookkeeping. I ran a full-service financial consulting firm. I had 42 active clients, 8 contractors, 2 full-time employees. I'd been doing it for 6 years while they thought I worked reception at a medical office. My sister asked why I'd lied. I said I hadn't lied. I just didn't correct their assumptions. My mother said that was the same thing. I said no. Lying was when you told someone something false. I'd simply let them believe what they wanted to believe about me. They wanted to believe I was struggling. I was barely making it. Poor Sarah with her old car and her little apartment and her dead-end job. So I let them. My uncle wanted to know why. I asked him if he remembered Thanksgiving 2 years ago. At my sister's new house. He'd spent an hour talking about his daughter's promotion. How proud he was. how hard she'd worked. I'd signed my first six-figure contract that morning. When my mother asked how I was doing, I said fine. My uncle asked if I remembered what he said. I told him he'd offered to help me get a job at his plant. In the mailroom. He'd said it would be good for me to have some stability. I'd been running a business worth over $1 million at that point. But he thought I needed help getting a mailroom job. So I smiled and thanked him and said I'd think about it. My sister's face had gone very pale. She asked if this was real. If I really had a business that successful. Morrison confirmed it. He said he'd reviewed my financials as part of establishing the trust for my son. My business was legitimate and profitable. My personal assets were substantial. My uncle asked how substantial. I told them my business was worth approximately $1.6 million in total assets. My personal net worth, including equity, savings, and investments, was just over $900,000. My son and I lived in a small apartment because I was saving for a house. I drove an old car because I didn't care what I drove. I worked the medical office reception 3 days a week because I liked the people and it gave me health insurance, and I didn't need to prove anything to strangers. But I did need to stop letting my family think they knew me. My grandfather had been right about that. My mother stood up. She said this was ridiculous. She said I couldn't possibly have built all that without anyone knowing. Someone would have said something. Someone would have seen. I asked her who. None of them ever asked me real questions. None of them ever visited my apartment. None of them knew my friends or my clients or my life. They knew the version of me they'd decided on when I got pregnant at 22. Everything after that was just confirmation of what they'd already decided. My sister said that wasn't fair. She said they'd tried to help me. I asked her when. She said they'd offered advice, job suggestions, support. I asked her to name one time she'd actually asked me if I needed help instead of assuming I did. One time she'd asked what I was working on instead of telling me what I should do. She couldn't answer. My uncle said this didn't change anything. The will was still wrong. My grandfather should have divided everything equally. That's what fair meant. I asked him if fair meant giving equal amounts to people in unequal situations. His kids had 2 parents with 6-figure incomes and no debt. My son had me. We'd been fine. We'd been better than fine. But my grandfather wanted to make sure my son had the same safety net their kids had. That wasn't unfair. That was balancing. Morrison checked his watch. He said he had another appointment in 20 minutes. He asked if there were any other questions about the estate distribution. My uncle said he wanted copies of everything. Every document related to the trust. Every piece of paper my grandfather had signed. Morrison said he'd have them couriered over that afternoon. My sister asked if they could still contest it. Morrison said they could try. He didn't recommend it. The documentation was solid. They'd spent a lot of money on lawyers and lose. My mother gathered her purse. She looked at me like she'd never seen me before. She said she didn't know who I was anymore. I told her she'd never known who I was. She'd just thought she did. There was a difference. She walked out without saying goodbye to my son. My sister followed her. My uncle stayed seated. He looked at the revenue report still sitting on the table. He asked if my grandfather had known about the business. I said yes. He'd known for almost a year. My uncle asked if that's why he'd changed the will. I said partly, but mostly because he'd watched everyone treat me like I was failing when I was succeeding. He wanted my son to know his mother hadn't been struggling. She'd been building. My uncle stood up. He said this wasn't over. I said it was. He left. Morrison started gathering his papers. He told me the trust documents would be delivered to my address within 3 business days. All the account access information would come with them. If I had questions, his office was available. I thanked him. My son asked if we could leave now. I said yes. We walked to the parking lot. My uncle's Escalade was already gone. My sister's Lexus was pulling out. My mother was in the passenger seat. Neither of them looked at us. I unlocked my Accord. My son climbed into the back seat. He asked if Grandpa really left him $1 million. I said yes. He asked if that meant we were rich. I told him we'd been doing fine before. Now we had options. He asked what kind of options. I said college without debt. A house with a yard. The ability to help other people someday. Maybe starting his own business if he wanted. The trust was there to give him room to become whoever he wanted to be. He asked if I was really rich too. I told him I'd been building my business since he was 2 years old. He said he didn't know that. I said I know. I said I'd kept it quiet because I wanted to make sure it was real before I talked about it. He asked if it was real now. I said yes. Very real. He asked if Grandma and Uncle Tim and Aunt Jennifer were mad. I said probably. He asked why. I said because people don't like finding out they were wrong about someone, especially when they were very sure they were right. He asked if we'd still see them. I said that was up to them. If they wanted to know us, really know us, we'd be here. If they wanted to keep believing their version of who we were, that was their choice. We drove home in silence. When we got to the apartment, my son went straight to his room. I sat on the couch and pulled out my phone. I had 17 missed calls. 6 from my mother. 4 from my sister. 7 from my uncle. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I opened my email instead. Patricia Reyes had sent me a message an hour ago. She'd heard from Morrison's office. Everything had gone according to plan. The trust was established and funded. My son's future was secure. She said congratulations. She said my grandfather would be proud. I sat there looking at the email for a long time. My phone kept buzzing with new calls. I turned the sound off. Eventually my son came out of his room. He asked what we were having for dinner. I said whatever he wanted. He said pizza. I ordered pizza. While we waited, he asked if things were going to be different now. I asked him what he meant. He said at school he told people we were regular. Not poor but not rich. Just normal. He asked if that was still true. I told him we were exactly the same people we were yesterday. We just had more options now. He asked if he had to tell people about the money. I said no. I said money was private. What mattered was what you did with your life. How you treated people. Whether you noticed what mattered. He said Grandpa used to say that. About noticing. I said yes he did. He asked if I noticed things. I said I tried to. He said he thought I was good at it. I asked him why. He said because I always knew what he needed even when he didn't say it. I told him that's what mothers did. He said not all mothers. Some of his friends' mothers didn't notice stuff. I told him everyone noticed different things. The pizza arrived. We ate at the kitchen table. My son told me about a project at school. Something about ecosystems. He needed to build a terrarium. I said we could go to the store this weekend and get supplies. He asked if we could get the good kind of plants. Not the cheap ones. I said yes. He grinned. After dinner, I gave him a bath and read him 2 chapters of his current book. He asked if we could read 3. I said it was a school night. He argued that we'd had a big day. Grandpa's trust was a big deal. 3 chapters made sense. I read the 3rd chapter. He fell asleep before I finished it. I went back to the living room and finally checked my voicemails. My mother's first message was incoherent. Something about betrayal and manipulation, and how could I? The second message was calmer. She said we needed to talk. The 3rd through 6th messages escalated back to anger. My sister's messages were similar. Hurt, then anger, then demands that I explain myself. My uncle's messages were different. The first 4 were threats. Legal action. Investigations. He'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. The last 3 were quieter. He said he just wanted to understand. He said his father had always been fair. This didn't seem fair. He said maybe there was something he was missing. I deleted all of them. Patricia called at 8:30. She asked how it went. I told her exactly like we'd expected. She asked if I was okay. I said yes. She said the next few weeks might be difficult. Family challenges to the will were messy even when they had no legal standing. I told her I was prepared. She said she knew I was. That's why she liked working with me. We talked through the logistics. The trust documents would arrive Friday. I'd need to set up the accounts and designate a co-trustee in case anything happened to me. She recommended someone outside the family. Someone I trusted with my son's future. I told her I'd think about it. She said take your time. Everything else was handled. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room and thought about my grandfather. The last conversation we'd had. 2 days before he died. He'd asked me if I was ready. I'd asked him ready for what. He'd smiled and said for people to see me clearly. I'd told him I wasn't sure anyone wanted to. He'd said that was their problem, not mine. He'd been right about that too. I called Patricia 3 days after the will reading. Friday afternoon. My son was at school. I had the trust documents spread across my kitchen table. Everything Morrison had sent over. Account numbers. Transfer confirmations. The full structure of what my grandfather had built for us. Patricia answered on the second ring. She asked how I was holding up. I told her I needed to talk about next steps. She said she'd been expecting my call. I asked her what she meant. She said families don't take this kind of thing quietly. Especially families like mine. I told her my uncle had called 17 times in 3 days. My sister had sent 12 text messages. My mother had shown up at my apartment twice. I hadn't been home either time. Patricia asked what they wanted. I said the same thing they always wanted. For me to be smaller, quieter, more grateful for whatever scraps they decided to give me. She asked if I was going to give them that. I said no. She said good. Then she asked what I wanted. I told her I wanted to set up the co-trustee designation. I wanted someone outside my family who understood what my grandfather had been trying to do. Someone who would protect my son's interests if something happened to me. She asked if I had someone in mind. I said I was hoping she'd agree to do it. There was a pause. Then she said she'd be honored. We spent 40 minutes going through the paperwork. Electronic signatures. Notarization. By the time we finished, the trust had 2 trustees. Me and Patricia Reyes. My son's future had redundancy built in. My mother couldn't manipulate it. My uncle couldn't contest it. My sister couldn't guilt me into sharing it. Patricia asked if I'd heard anything official from my family. Legal threats. Formal challenges. I said no. Just phone calls and texts and my mother standing outside my apartment building. She said that would probably change. People got desperate when they realized they'd lost control. I asked her what I should do if they escalated. She said document everything. Don't engage. Let her handle any legal communication. I told her I would. After we hung up, I sat looking at the documents. Everything signed. Everything protected. I thought about my grandfather sitting in his workshop, building cabinets nobody would see the inside of. Doing great work because he noticed it mattered. Even when nobody else did. My phone buzzed. My sister. I didn't answer. It buzzed again. My mother. I turned the sound off. 2 weeks passed. The calls slowed down. The texts became less frequent. I thought maybe they'd accepted it. Maybe they'd moved on. Then my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered before I realized what I'd done. She said we needed to talk. I asked about what. She said about being a family. About forgiveness. About not letting money destroy what we had. I asked her what exactly we had. She said we had each other. I asked her when the last time was that she'd asked me a real question about my life. She couldn't answer. I said that's what I thought. She said I was being cruel. I said I was being honest. There was a difference. She told me my uncle's daughter needed help with a down payment on a house. $30,000. They'd been counting on the inheritance. I asked her why that was my problem. She said because we were family. Because that's what family did. I asked her if family was what she'd been doing when she told everyone I was struggling. When she offered me condescending advice about going back to school for nursing. When she patted my hand and said I was doing the best I could while I was running a $1 million business. She said she hadn't known about the business. I said that was exactly my point. She hadn't known because she'd never asked. She'd just assumed. And now she wanted me to fix the consequences of her assumptions with money from a trust my grandfather had specifically set up to protect my son from people like her. She hung up. 3 days later, my sister sent me an email. Long, detailed. She said she'd been thinking about everything. About how hard it must have been for me. Raising a son alone. Building a business nobody knew about. She said she understood why I'd kept it quiet. She said she wished I'd felt comfortable telling them. She said maybe they could start over. Maybe they could get to know the real me. The last paragraph asked if I could loan her $50,000. Her husband's business was having cash flow issues. Just temporary. She'd pay me back with interest. She even included a proposed repayment schedule. I deleted the email. My uncle tried a different approach. He sent a letter to my business address. Professional letterhead. His attorney had drafted it. It said there were concerns about my grandfather's mental state when he'd signed the codicil. It said they had evidence of undue influence. It said they were prepared to pursue legal remedies unless we could reach a reasonable settlement. The settlement they proposed was redistributing half the trust equally among all 4 grandchildren. I forwarded it to Patricia. She called me an hour later. She was laughing. She asked if I wanted her to respond. I said yes. She said she'd make it clear that any further communication needed to go through her office. That threats of litigation without standing were harassment. That if they wanted to pursue this, they should be prepared to spend $200,000 on lawyers for the privilege of losing. She sent the response that afternoon. My uncle didn't contact me again. For weeks after the will reading, my son asked if we were going to Thanksgiving at Grandma's house. I asked him if he wanted to go. He thought about it. He said he didn't know. He said last year Aunt Jennifer's daughter got to help make the pie, and he just sat at the kids' table and nobody talked to him. I asked him what he wanted to do instead. He said maybe we could have Thanksgiving at our apartment. Just us. Maybe order something good and watch movies. I told him that sounded perfect. My mother called the week before Thanksgiving. She asked if we were coming. I said no. She asked why not. I said because my son didn't want to. She said that was ridiculous. He was 8. He didn't get to make those decisions. I said actually he did. She said I was being spiteful, using my child to punish them. I said I was listening to my child about where he felt comfortable. If that meant we stayed home, we stayed home. She said they were still my family. I said family was supposed to care about you, not just the version of you they'd decided on. She said I'd changed. I said no. I'd just stopped pretending to be who they wanted me to be. There was a difference. She said my grandfather would be disappointed. I said my grandfather left my son over $1 million specifically because he saw what they didn't. He saw me building something while they saw me failing. He saw me succeeding while they saw me struggling. He knew exactly who I was. That's why he wrote page 12. She hung up. Thanksgiving was quiet. My son and I ordered Thai food and watched 3 movies. We made a blanket fort in the living room. He asked if I missed Grandma's house. I asked him if he did. He said not really. He said it was nice not having to be quiet all the time. Not having to listen to grown-ups talk about things he didn't understand. I told him I knew what he meant. Between the 2nd and 3rd movie, he asked me something. He said his friend Connor's mom had asked him what my job was. Connor had told her I did bookkeeping. My son wanted to know what to say. I told him I ran a financial consulting firm. He asked what that meant. I explained it in terms he could understand. I helped businesses keep track of their money and make good decisions. He asked if that was important. I said yes. Very important. He asked if I made a lot of money doing it. I told him I made enough that we were safe. That he'd be able to go to college without debt. That we'd be able to buy a house when we were ready. That we had options. He asked if that made us rich. I said it made us secure. There was a difference. He nodded. Then he said he was going to tell Connor's mom I was a consultant. That sounded cool. I told him that was fine. December came. The trust documents were finalized. Patricia had everything organized. The accounts were accessible. I could see every dollar my grandfather had saved over 38 years. Every contribution. Every dividend. Every bit of growth. It was meticulous. Careful. The same way he'd built those cabinets. Great work because he noticed it mattered. I started looking at houses. Nothing extravagant. 3 bedrooms. Good school district. A yard for my son. I found one I liked in a neighborhood 20 minutes from my current apartment. The seller was motivated. I made an offer. They accepted. I didn't tell my family. The closing was scheduled for mid-January. I told my son the week before Christmas. He asked if we were really moving. I said yes. He asked if he'd have to change schools. I said no. The new house was in the same district. He asked if he'd have his own room. I said yes. A bigger one. with space for the terrarium we'd built and his books and whatever else he wanted. He asked if Grandma knew. I said no. He asked if we were going to tell her. I said eventually. When we were ready. He seemed satisfied with that. Christmas was quiet too. Just us. I got my son the expensive science kit he'd been wanting. The one with the real microscope. He got me a picture frame with a photo of us at the park. He'd made it at school. It had pieces of painted macaroni glued around the edges. I put it on my desk. We moved into the new house on January 18th. The movers came early. My son supervised where his boxes went. He picked the bedroom at the end of the hall. It had windows on 2 walls and got good light in the morning. I took the master bedroom. We spent the first night eating pizza on the floor of the living room because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. My son asked if this was really ours. I said yes. He asked if we were going to stay here for a long time. I said as long as we wanted. He asked if anyone could take it away. I said no. The house was paid for. Nobody could take it. He nodded and took another bite of pizza. On February 3rd, my mother called. From her regular number. I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. She said she'd driven by my apartment. The landlord said I'd moved out. She asked where I'd gone. I gave her the address. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if I'd bought a house. I said yes. She asked how. I said with money for my business. The business she'd never asked about. She said she wanted to see it. I asked why. She said because I was her daughter. Because she wanted to see where her grandson was living. I told her she could come by Saturday afternoon. 2 o'clock. She said she'd be there. She arrived at 1:45. My sister was with her. I hadn't expected that. They stood on the front porch and I opened the door. My mother looked past me into the house. She asked if we could come in. I said yes. They walked through slowly. Looking at everything. The furniture I'd bought. The art on the walls. My son's science kit set up on the dining room table. The backyard visible through the kitchen windows. My mother stopped in the living room. She looked at the picture frame with the macaroni on my bookshelf. She asked if my son made that. I said yes. My sister asked how much the house cost. I told her that was private. She said she was just curious. I said I was sure she was. My mother asked if I'd used the trust money. I said no. The trust was for my son's future. This was from my business income. My sister's face shifted. She asked how much my business made. I told her enough. My mother sat down on the couch without asking. She said this was a lot of house for 2 people. I said it was the right amount of house for us. She said it must be lonely, not having family around. I asked her when family had ever been around. She said that wasn't fair. They'd always been there. I asked her where. Where had they been when I was building my business? When I was raising my son alone? When I was working 3 jobs to make rent? She said they'd offered help. I asked her what help. She said advice. Suggestions. Support. I told her those weren't help. Those were ways of making herself feel better about not actually helping. Real help was asking what I needed. Real help was seeing me clearly instead of seeing what she wanted to see. My sister said I was being harsh. I asked her if she remembered the email she'd sent. The one asking for $50,000. She looked away. I asked her if she'd have sent that email if I was really the struggling single mother she'd told everyone I was. She didn't answer. My mother said she just wanted things to go back to normal. I asked her what normal was. Her treating me like I was failing while I succeeded? Her offering condescending advice while I built something she couldn't imagine? Her excluding my son from the family narrative because he didn't fit the story she wanted to tell? She said that wasn't what she'd done. I said that was exactly what she'd done. My son came down the stairs. He stopped when he saw them. My mother smiled and said hello. He said hi back. Quiet. My sister asked how he liked the new house. He said it was good. My mother asked if he wanted to show her his room. He looked at me. I told him he didn't have to if he didn't want to. He said it was okay. They went upstairs. My sister stayed in the living room with me. She asked if I was happy. I asked her if it mattered. She said of course it mattered. I asked her when. When had my happiness mattered to her? She said always. I asked her to name one time she'd asked me if I was happy. One conversation where she'd wanted to know what I wanted instead of telling me what I should want. She couldn't. She said she was sorry. I asked her what she was sorry for. She said for not seeing me. For assuming. For treating me like I was less than. I asked her if she was sorry she'd done it or sorry she'd been wrong. She didn't answer. I said that's what I thought. My mother came back downstairs. My son stayed in his room. She said it was a nice room. Big. Good light. I said yes. She asked if we were going to come to Easter. I asked her why we would. She said because that's what families did. I told her families also saw each other. Really saw each other. Not just the versions they wanted to see. She said she was trying. I said she was trying now because she'd been proven wrong. Not because she'd wanted to see me. Because she'd been forced to. She said that wasn't true. I said yes it was. If my grandfather hadn't left that trust. If the lawyer hadn't made me read page 12. If I hadn't shown them the revenue reports. They'd still be treating me exactly the same way. Still offering me advice I didn't need. Still assuming I was struggling. Still excluding my son from their idea of the family. My sister said they wanted to do better. I told her doing better meant actually changing. Not just saying the words. It meant asking questions instead of making assumptions. It meant seeing my son as equal to their other grandchildren. It meant treating me like an adult with a successful life instead of a charity case who needed their help. My mother stood up. She said she didn't know how to do that. I told her she could start by leaving. By giving us space. By not calling unless she had something real to say. Not advice. Not suggestions. Not requests for money. Something real. She asked how long. I said as long as it took for her to figure out who I actually was instead of who she'd decided I was. They left. My son came back downstairs after their car pulled away. He asked if they were mad. I said probably. He asked if we were going to see them again. I said maybe. Eventually. When they were ready to see us as we really were. He asked what if they were never ready. I said then we'd be fine without them. We'd been fine this long. He went back to his room. I sat in the living room looking at the macaroni picture frame. Thinking about my grandfather. About great work. About noticing what mattered. 3 weeks passed. My business hit $500,000 in quarterly revenue. I hired a third full-time employee. A young woman fresh out of her accounting program. Smart. Detail-oriented. She reminded me of myself 8 years ago. I paid her $65,000 to start. More than I'd made in my first 3 jobs combined. My son turned 9. We had a party at the house. 10 kids from his school. Pizza and cake and a science-themed scavenger hunt in the backyard. Connor's mother asked me about my business while the kids ran around. I told her the truth. She looked surprised. She asked why I'd never mentioned it. I told her I'd gotten used to keeping it quiet. She asked why. I said long story. My mother didn't call on my son's birthday. Neither did my sister. My uncle sent a card with $20 in it. The same card he'd sent every year. Generic. Impersonal. My son put it with the others and went back to his party. In March, I got an email from Patricia. She said my uncle had officially dropped any plans to contest the will. His attorney had advised him it was unwinnable. The trust was secure. My son's future was protected. She said congratulations. She said my grandfather had built something that would last. I forwarded the email to my personal folder. The one where I kept everything important. Business contracts. Property deeds. The picture my son had drawn when he was 5 of us holding hands. The letter my grandfather had written. Page 12. I reread it sometimes. The part where he told me to stop hiding. The part where he said my son needed to know what his mother had built. The part where he said people deserved to see me clearly. He'd been right about all of it. In April, my mother called. She said she'd been thinking. She said she wanted to try. Really try. She asked if she could take my son to the Science Museum. Just the 2 of them. She said she'd read about an exhibit on ecosystems and thought he'd like it. I asked my son. He thought about it. He said okay. But he wanted me to pick him up after. Not stay at Grandma's house. I told my mother. She agreed. She picked him up on a Saturday morning. I watched them drive away. I worked on client files while they were gone. 3 hours later, she brought him back. He was carrying a bag from the museum gift shop. A book about marine biology. He said Grandma bought it for him. I thanked her. She asked if he had fun. He said yes. She asked if she could do it again sometime. He said maybe. After she left, my son showed me everything they'd seen. The tide pool exhibit. The butterfly garden. The planetarium show. He was excited. More animated than I'd seen him in months. I asked if Grandma was nice. He said yes. Different than before. She asked him questions. Real questions. About school. About what he liked. What he wanted to be when he grew up. I asked what he told her. He said he told her he wanted to be a scientist. Or maybe run a business like me. She said both of those sounded good. He said it was weird. Grandma being nice. I said maybe she was trying. He said maybe. My sister called in May. She asked if we could have coffee. Just us. I agreed to meet her at a place halfway between our houses. Neutral territory. We sat outside. She ordered a latte. I got black coffee. She said she'd been in therapy. Working through some things. I said that was good. She said the therapist asked her about family dynamics. About relationships. About assumptions she'd made. She said she'd spent a lot of time thinking about me. About how she'd treated me. She said she'd been jealous. I asked her of what. She said of how I'd managed alone. How I'd built something without help. Without validation. Without anyone watching. She said she'd never been able to do anything without people seeing it. Without approval. Without recognition. She said when she found out about my business she felt stupid. Like she'd missed something obvious. But also angry. Because if I could succeed quietly, what did that say about her need to announce everything? I told her it didn't say anything. People were different. She said maybe. But she said she'd used that difference as an excuse to dismiss me. To treat my quiet success as failure because it didn't look like hers. I asked her why she was telling me this. She said because she wanted to do better. Not just say it. Actually do it. She asked if I'd be willing to try. To let her try. I told her I'd think about it. We finished our coffee. She asked about my son. I told her he was good. Doing well in school. Happy in the new house. She asked if she could see him sometime. Not at a family thing. Just her and him. Maybe take him for ice cream. Get to know him. I said I'd ask him. She said that was fair. In June my business crossed $700,000 in revenue for the year. I was on track to break $1 million by December. I hired 2 more contractors. Expanded into tax strategy consulting. My clients were growing. Their businesses were thriving. They referred other people. The work was good. Solid. The kind my grandfather would have respected. My son finished 3rd grade. His teacher said he was one of the most curious students she'd had. Always asking questions. Always noticing things. I thought about my grandfather. About how he'd always said the people who noticed things mattered more than people thought. In July my mother asked if we'd come to a family dinner. Not a holiday. Just dinner. She wanted to try. She said my uncle would be there. My sister. Their families. She said she'd talk to them. About doing better. About seeing us clearly. I asked my son if he wanted to go. He said he didn't know. I said we didn't have to decide right now. We decided to go. One dinner. To see if things were really different. We drove to my mother's house on a Saturday evening. My uncle's Escalade was in the driveway. My sister's Lexus next to it. My Accord looked small beside them. My son asked if it was okay that we had an old car. I told him the car didn't matter. What mattered was how we showed up. He nodded. My mother opened the door. She hugged my son first. Then me. My sister was in the kitchen. She waved. My uncle was setting the table. He looked up when we came in. He said hello. Quiet. Different than before. My son stayed close to me. Dinner was awkward. Everyone was trying too hard. My uncle asked about my business. Polite questions. Nothing aggressive. I answered briefly. My sister asked my son about school. He told her about his science project. She listened. Actually listened. My mother asked if anyone wanted more food. The conversation was stilted but not cruel. After dinner, my uncle asked to talk to me. Alone. We went to the porch. He said he'd been wrong. About the will. About me. About everything. He said he'd spent 6 months angry before he realized the anger was at himself. For not seeing me. For assuming. For treating me like I needed his help when I'd been fine the whole time. If you are watching this unfold and you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because what he said next changed everything. He said his daughter had asked him why Grandpa had left so much to my son. He'd tried to explain it and realized he couldn't. Because he didn't actually know me. Didn't know what I'd built or what I'd overcome or what my life was really like. He'd just known the version he'd decided on. The version that made him feel better about himself. The version where he was successful and I was struggling, and that meant he was doing something right. He said finding out I'd been succeeding the whole time had broken something in him. Made him look at everything differently. He said he was sorry. Really sorry. Not because he'd been wrong. Because he'd been cruel while being wrong. There was a difference. I told him I appreciated that. He asked if we could start over. If he could get to know the real me instead of the version he'd invented. I said maybe. Eventually. When I was ready. He said he understood. We went back inside. My son was showing my mother's phone something on his phone. A video from school. She was watching it. Smiling. My sister was cleaning up the kitchen. Everything was quiet. Different. Not fixed. But different. We left an hour later. My son asked if dinner was okay. I said it was fine. He asked if we were going to go back. I said maybe. Sometimes. When we wanted to. Not because we had to. He said that sounded good. 3 months later, my business broke $1 million in annual revenue. I didn't tell my family. I told Patricia. She said my grandfather would be proud. I said I thought so too. She asked what I was going to do to celebrate. I said nothing big. Maybe dinner with my son. Maybe a movie. She laughed. She said that sounded exactly right. My son is 11 now. The trust has grown to $1.4 million. He doesn't think about it much. He's focused on school. On his friends. On the science fair project he's building. On being a kid. The way he should be. My mother calls once a week. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we don't. My sister and I have coffee every few months. We're working on it. Building something new. Different than before. More honest. My uncle sent my son a birthday card last month. It had $100 in it and a note about a science camp he thought my son might like. The note was specific. Thoughtful. Like he'd actually paid attention. I still drive the same Accord. I could afford something new. But I like it. It reminds me of where I came from. What I built while people weren't watching. My business is worth $2.3 million now. I have 12 employees. 68 clients. I'm opening a second office next spring. My son asked me last week if I was happy. I said yes. He asked if I ever thought about Grandpa. I said all the time. He asked what I thought about. I said about how he saw me clearly when nobody else did. How he built something that would last. How he taught me that great work mattered even when people didn't notice. My son said people notice you now. I said yes. But I said the work mattered before they noticed too. That was the point. You don't do great work for recognition. You do it because you notice it matters. Even when you're the only one who does. He nodded. Then he went back to his homework. I sat there looking at the macaroni picture frame on my bookshelf. Thinking about my grandfather's workshop. About cabinets nobody would see the inside of. About doing things right because you notice the difference. I don't talk to my family every day. Sometimes I don't talk to them for weeks. But when I do, they ask real questions now. They see me clearly. Or they're trying to. That's enough. For now. My son is happy. Safe. Loved. He has options. A future. Security. The things my grandfather wanted him to have. The things he built that trust to give him. Not just money. Room to become whoever he wants to be. I built my business. My life. My son's future. I did it quietly while people thought I was failing. I let them think what they wanted because proving them wrong wasn't the point. Building something solid was the point. Something that would last. Something my son could stand on. My grandfather understood that. He built his whole life understanding that. And on page 12, he told me to stop hiding it. To let people see what I'd built. Not for them. For my son. So he'd know what his mother had accomplished. So he'd know what you do when people underestimate you. You don't announce it. You don't prove them wrong with words. You build something so solid they can't ignore it. Even when they try. Even when they want to. You build something that lasts. That's what I did. That's what my grandfather taught me. That's what I'm teaching my son. So, did I go too far? Or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.